The Healthcare Labyrinth podcast is back for another episode. Join Mark S. Ryan, a veteran health plan and health technology executive, as he explores the world of healthcare.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. My name is Mark Ryan, and it's a pleasure to be hosting the podcast, and thanks to everyone for listening in. Today, we're going to cover a little bit about the election. I'm actually going to be reflecting on what I call the biggest lie of the recent vice presidential debate that happened, I think, on October 1st, so a couple of weeks ago here. But the Republican candidate, Vance, I'm giving the award for the biggest lie of the VP debate. I think there was quite a bit that where twisted facts were the case on both sides between Vance and Waltz. But I think the biggest lie does go to J.D. Vance. And in essence, Vance, I say, is sort of reinventing history, and it revolves around the Affordable Care Act. Now, generally speaking, healthcare has not gotten a great deal of coverage in any of the debates or even in the campaign. And that's unfortunate because I do believe that healthcare is a very important issue to most people. You see that immigration and the economy are sort of the big issues in the campaign. I think healthcare is a little bit of an economic issue because it's a family budget issue. And when we see costs going up and up and up, that's clearly an economic issue for healthcare affordability. Your premiums are skyrocketing, whether you have Affordable Care Act coverage or employer coverage, and that's a big issue. But polls also show that below those top issues of the economy and immigration, healthcare actually is sitting there, sometimes just below the top couple of issues, sometimes in the top five. And I've always argued that in some of these swing states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, that the healthcare issue could come into focus with some of these swing voters because it is a relatively important issue. But anyway, let's get back to what I call the biggest lie of the VP debate from J.D. Vance. So what was this so-called tall tale that Vance actually said? And so Vance basically attempted to concoct a story that somehow former President Trump salvaged the Affordable Care Act when it was on the verge of collapse. As we know, the Affordable Care Act is incredibly controversial, although a majority of people in America today support it. Not only did it ensure that people were not cut off from insurance or paid higher rates if they had pre-existing conditions, but it extended parents' coverage to children up to the age of 26. And it really did two things. It set up the expansion of Medicaid to about 135% of poverty at very enhanced reimbursement rates. Right now, it's about 90% from the Fed, 10% from the state. And that was just sort of put in law. Most states have expanded Medicaid to those levels, but there's about 10 holdout states. And the second major coverage thing that the Affordable Care Act clearly did was to set up the federal and state healthcare exchanges where premium subsidies and for even lower income people, cost-sharing subsidies are offered in that program. That program has blossomed over the years under President Biden. We'll get a little more into that. But that's basically what the Affordable Care Act did. And again, Vance attempted to concoct a story that somehow former President Trump salvaged the ACA when it was on the verge of collapse. This, of course, in my view, is true only in Vance's and Trump's minds. And it was really a fanciful rewrite of history. And it sort of goes like this. At the VP debate, Vance said Trump, quote, actually implemented some of these regulations when he was president of the United States. And I think you can make a really good argument that it salvaged Obamacare, which was doing disastrously until Donald Trump came along. I think this is an important point about President Trump. When Obamacare was crushing under the weight of its own regulatory burden and healthcare costs, Donald Trump could have destroyed the program. Instead, he worked in a bipartisan way to ensure that Americans had access to affordable care, unquote. This is similar to what Trump himself tried to spin at the presidential debate in September. He said, quote, Obamacare was lousy health care, always was. It's not very good today. I had a choice to make when I was president. Do I save it and make it as good as it can be, never going to be great, or do I let it rot? And I felt I had an obligation, even though politically it would have been good to just let it rot and let it go away, end quote. So those were sort of the two quotes, one from Vance in the VP debate in October and one from Trump in the presidential debate in September. Let's try and take it apart a little bit before our first break. Well, going back up to Vance's quote, he said that Trump actually implemented some regulations. Well, I guess that's true. There were regulations moving through, and the Trump administration from 2017 to 21 had to make some decisions about the program. But I do not believe he did anything to help the Affordable Care Act along the way. As you'll hear after our break, it's very clear that he put a lot of barriers and obstacles, some of which were regulatory, some of which were administrative, and even some of them legal. So I just don't remember it that way at all, and I've tracked these things pretty closely. And again, Vance said Obamacare was crushing under the weight of its own regulatory burden, and somehow Donald Trump salvaged it. The truth is, as you'll hear a little later, that I think he actually did create more problems for the Affordable Care Act exchanges. And as to Trump's quote, he has his views on whether Affordable Care Act coverage is good or bad. I think there's a lot of facets to that argument. Some are good, some may be bad, but the reality is that overall Obamacare has been a benefit, because really the alternative to what Trump calls lousy health care is in many cases for millions of people no health care at all. And so that certainly needs to be taken into consideration here. And again, the idea that somehow Trump could have let it rot, but he came in on his white horse to save it. Again, tremendous doubts in my mind about that. And so at this time, we'll take our first break, and we'll come back from that break for me to sort of lay out the facts and let you decide whether Trump, according to Vance, really did salvage the ACA, or did he put even more barriers and made it even more difficult to operate the law. Be right back.
The Healthcare Labyrinth is no ordinary website. It features news and commentary from one of the nation's leading healthcare policy and technology experts. Mark Ryan combs the internet for the latest healthcare news and publishes a news feed each weekday with summations and Mark's insights. Twice a week, Mark publishes a blog to go deep into a current issue. And of course, Mark hosts a podcast each week to delve even further. All of this is available at healthcarelabyrinth.com. Visit each day for the latest happenings in healthcare. As well, learn more about Mark's book, The Healthcare Labyrinth, at the website. That's healthcarelabyrinth.com, your go-to source for healthcare news.
Welcome back, and we hope you're enjoying this episode of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. We're here talking about the recent vice presidential debate and a claim, fanciful in my mind, that was made by J.D. Vance that somehow Donald Trump and his administration somehow salvaged the ACA. So I promised to sort of, after my commentary at the beginning, to give you some hard facts to let you decide whether Trump salvaged the ACA when he was in office or whether he actually put even more barriers up against the program and actually sought to undermine it. So here is what Trump, in my mind, actually did to the ACA. I believe he undermined it at almost every pass. So first, on coming into office, Trump used his regulatory authority to massively rein in marketing and outreach dollars. He shortened the enrollment period and made a number of other changes that clearly constrained enrollment. And that message went out right when he really came into office, in my view. Number two, both Barack Obama, shockingly, and Donald Trump underfunded some critical programs meant to stabilize finances in the new exchanges early on. So there were the so-called 3 Rs that were put in place: risk adjustment, reinsurance, and risk corridor programs. Now, risk adjustment remains in the exchange program today, and that just makes sure that rates go up for those serving sicker populations. Rates are slightly lower for those that are serving healthier populations. But there were 2 other transitional programs in the exchanges, one called reinsurance and one called risk corridor programs, that were very important to insurers to make sure in the first 3 years their risk was mitigated. Part of the so-called losses in these areas were shared by the government, and this meant the lowest premiums possible. Now, of course, when you are moving into new way of rating these populations from underwriting to universal universal rates, regardless of your health, obviously premiums were moving up. And that's controversial, but I still believe it was the right move, because that's essentially what's done in employer coverage as well. But these other 2 programs, reinsurance and risk corridors, were meant to mitigate increases and to protect health insurers in the program, since it was really hard to predict exactly what was going to occur when this major sweeping change from underwriting to community rating happened. So in the case of reinsurance, after a critical threshold of cost per member, the government was essentially kicking in through assessments on all the plans to that plan suffering big losses for a member to mitigate that per member cost in a given year for the catastrophic event that they were feeling. So that was actually underfunded by both Obama and Trump. They did not live up to their commitment to fund that fully. In the second case, the risk corridor programs were massively underfunded by both the Obama and the Trump administrations. And that was where, after all these other reconciliations occurred for reinsurance and risk adjustment, there was shared gains and shared losses with the government to stabilize some of the insurers that had major losses. Again, that promise was not kept either. The plans with big losses were given very few dollars over the 3 years. And that was really a decision by the Obama and the Trump administrations. So that's the sort of second problem that Trump had in terms of supporting or not supporting the exchanges. Third issue, Trump challenged the ACA in court and failed. On several occasions, the administration went into court and said they wanted to see aspects or the entire law overturned. And that certainly undermined confidence in the program in the minds of insurers who were participating. Next, he and his GOP comrades in the House and Senate attempted to repeal the act, in part in favor of a mishmash of block grants to states to replace the Medicaid expansion in the exchange program. The proposed alternative, when they were trying to repeal the ACA, relied heavily on the old and tired concepts of risk pools and more. We'll get into risk pools a little later. The repeal effort died in the Senate when a handful of courageous Republicans voted against the repeal. Among them was the late Senator John McCain, who came back to Washington after his brain cancer diagnosis to courageously vote no. Trump also sought to dissuade states from expanding Medicaid under the ACA in favor of other schemes, such as generous uncompensated hospital care funding, like he did for Florida, and work requirements in favor of just a partial expansion in Georgia. In perhaps the most egregious example of undermining the program, Trump backed deappropriating the cost-sharing reduction subsidies, which are different from the premium subsidies. The premium subsidies cover individuals from 100% to 400% of the federal poverty level. They are sent to plans on behalf of enrollees, and that reduces premiums for those individuals. In the case of the cost-sharing reduction subsidies, for those between 100 and 250% of poverty, additional payments were sent to plans to buy down or reduce the cost-sharing requirements of individuals in certain plans. And so this CSR subsidy was deappropriated by Trump and the Republicans. This actually forced plans to massively inflate premiums because they still had a duty to offer these low-income cost-sharing reduction plans under the law. So this actually cost the federal government more in premium subsidies than it saved on the CSR appropriation. So that's very interesting. Republicans pitched the story that somehow the funding was a huge giveaway to rich health plans. In fact, that was not the case. The dollars given to them went right out the door because they were reducing cost sharing for these lower income people. So in essence, Trump and the Republicans accomplished their goal of destabilizing the program, and insurers lost faith. When President Biden came into office, he reversed many but not all of the damage done by Trump. And the proof of the hurt here that Trump did to the ACA can be seen in a chart that I published with a companion blog on October 3rd. So you can go to the blog tab of healthcarelabyrinth.com, call up that chart to look at what I did in that chart as further proof that Trump was essentially destabilizing the Affordable Care Act, not salvaging it. And that chart, just so I can give you a feel for it, has the years 2014, when the exchanges started, all the way through 2024. It shows the average enrollment, or the high enrollment really, in each of those years. It has the average silver benchmark premium per month in those years and the increase from the prior year, and the average number of marketplace insurers per state. And what's interesting about this chart is you can see that when Trump came to office and implemented many of the regulatory changes and backed repeal, we saw exchange premiums skyrocket, enrollment go down, and plan participation drop. And the exchanges became a financially perilous place. When Biden came back to office, premiums dropped or grew at a reasonable rate, and plan participation increased. Most importantly, enrollment surged and made the risk in the exchanges much better for insurers, which allowed lower premiums. Now, admittedly, we will see some fairly robust premium increases going into 2025, but overall, the record is clear. President Biden had confidence in the exchanges, promoted them, and plan participation, enrollment, and premiums were much better. Under Trump, of course, premiums skyrocketed, enrollment dropped, and you had fewer plans participating in the program. And again, I would say that the biggest damage done by Trump occurred with the defunding of the CSR subsidies, causing premiums to surge from an average of $359 in 2017 to $481 per month in 2018, just a crippling impact. This crippled middle-income families the most, who really received no premium subsidy under the law. Many of them joined the ranks of the uninsured because they could not afford the huge hike in premiums under Trump. In summary, Trump's and Vance's declarations on salvaging the ACA are just simply wild and untrue. There is nothing to back it up. And they both seem to be back on the repeal bandwagon, but with the same tired ideas as before. I am a Republican, but I am here to say that these views emanate from a twisted idea in many Republican lawmakers' minds that health care is a commodity to be earned as you achieve wealth. I would ask, where is the compassion in all that? So I'll let you stew over a little bit and come to your own conclusion about whether Trump sabotaged or saved the ACA. I certainly believe he tried to sabotage it. We'll take our next break now, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about all the confusion from Vance and Trump related to what they actually would do in the future if they came to office on the ACA. Be right back.
Health plans and insurance are confusing. Our healthcare system is in dire need of reform. Health policy expert Mark Ryan tackles both issues in his book, The Healthcare Labyrinth. It is both a guide to navigating health plans and fixing American health insurance. Mark dives deep into how health plans and the American health insurance system operate. He then outlines a comprehensive reform agenda for the system as a whole, including pricing, emphasizing health and care management, and ensuring affordable access to health coverage in a private delivery model. Mark is a bit of an unconventional Republican in that he believes affordable access is the morally right thing to do, and that it is also fiscally prudent for our nation. Learn more about Mark's book, The Healthcare Labyrinth, at healthcarelabyrinth.com or search at leading bookseller websites. Available in print, ebook, and audiobook forms.
Welcome back, and we hope you're enjoying this episode of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. We're talking about what I call the big lie from J.D. Vance at the recent VP debate related to how Donald Trump supposedly saved the world and saved the ACA when he was in office, when it was on the verge of collapse. I think you know where I stand on that by now. But I did promise to give you a feel for what Trump and Vance are talking about on the campaign trail. I think there's one takeaway here. I think both of them are massively confused about what they would do on the ACA. I don't really believe they have a plan, and they are mixing and matching words that are very different, and it just sort of proves that healthcare is not a real major priority for either of them here. And that's a little bit disappointing to me because I had some hope that given Vance's background, coming from an impoverished childhood, and given some things he did say earlier about the ACA, that he may look upon this very differently. But I think he's falling in line with Trump and the Freedom Caucus folks on perhaps repealing the ACA again. So let's talk a little about what they have said, as confusing as it is. So Donald Trump on the campaign trail and at the first presidential debate was asked about the ACA and what they would do. And Trump basically said that if he could make it better, he would repeal the ACA, but it had to be a better concept. So he was trying to waffle and equivocate a bit, and that he was developing a plan, and there was a bit of a semblance of a plan that he had, but he couldn't tell you what it was. So again, I don't think Trump has a plan, but that's what he said at the presidential debate and a couple times on the campaign trail. Well, J.D. Vance sort of picked up on this on the campaign trail as well as at the vice presidential debate. And I think Vance, again, created even more confusion. So on the campaign trail, Vance basically talked about an alternative that would essentially be separating sicker folks from healthier folks, allowing healthier folks to get better premiums. He was very concerned that the Affordable Care Act drove up premiums for healthier populations, and that there would be separate risk pools between the healthy and the adverse. And so these adverse folks that had pre-existing conditions and trouble getting insurance would move over to these risk pools for the adverse. Now, the truth is that concept has been tried and I think largely failed in the past over several decades in states. States did set up what are adverse risk pools to attempt to cover people. They were appropriations and subsidies from the government, sometimes funded by insurance taxes, but those risk pools would partially subsidize the premium of these adverse individuals so they could be covered. Well, the history is that the risk pools did not work so well. They had financial problems. And number two, they did not always buy down the cost of premiums for these adverse folks enough to make these individuals get steady coverage. And many of them, frankly, could not afford the premiums, and therefore they remained or became uninsured. So the history of these separate risk funds has not been very good. But that is essentially what J.D. Vance led you to believe is in Donald Trump's plan on the campaign trail. Well, when he arrived at the vice presidential debate, Vance sort of tweaked what he said a little bit. Instead of talking about separate risk pools, he basically characterized an ACA alternative as reinsurance for higher risk members. Now, I would note that reinsurance is very, very different than separate risk pools. Usually, reinsurance would mean everybody is in the same risk pool, whether you're healthy or you're adverse and have major disease states. And insurers are then compensated for very high claim amounts through a reinsurance mechanism. So again, you'd all be in the same pool. And if a adverse person had very high or catastrophic claims, say 50,000, 75,000, 100,000 a year, reinsurance would kick in from the government, again, potentially funded by a government appropriation or by taxes on the insurers or pooling resources from the insurers. And that insurer that had the catastrophic claim would be given a reinsurance amount. Again, very different than having separate risk pools for the adverse and the healthy. I conclude from this pivot from risk pools to reinsurance that Vance and Trump really don't understand what they are saying. And it seems to prove that neither Trump or Vance really has a plan, a credible alternative to the ACA. It seems to me that it's all talk. Risk pools for high-risk individuals, again, have a mixed and terrible record and are incredibly expensive. Reinsurance is indeed a good concept, but I don't think they understand what they're doing there. And I would also note again that Trump actually underfunded the reinsurance program in the exchanges when he was president, as I noted earlier. So that would seem to lay doubt that that's a credible plan or one they really, really believe in, even if it could be made to work. I, in fact, support the return of reinsurance and perhaps risk corridors, which was the other program Trump and Obama underfunded in the exchanges. I believe it would further stabilize and expand the program footprint by making it available in certain hard-to-reach areas. And there are some models that expand reinsurance, as in Waltz's Minnesota, that might even help those who are unsubsidized, but it certainly doesn't mean separating out the healthy from the adverse. They really need to be in that same pool for reinsurance to work. I don't think it's an alternative to the subsidies we have today in the exchange program for both cost sharing as well as premiums. And I would note, for all of the doubters out there like Trump and Vance, the sick and the healthy are in the same risk pool in employer coverage. It has been that way for decades, and it's worked pretty well. So with that, we'll take our last break, and we'll be right back for a couple conclusions.
The Healthcare Labyrinth is no ordinary website. It features news and commentary from one of the nation's leading healthcare policy and technology experts. Mark Ryan combs the internet for the latest healthcare news and publishes a news feed each weekday with summations and Mark's insights. Twice a week, Mark publishes a blog to go deep into a current issue. And of course, Mark hosts a podcast each week to delve even further. All of this is available at healthcarelabyrinth.com. Visit each day for the latest happenings in healthcare. As well, learn more about Mark's book, The Healthcare Labyrinth, at the website. That's healthcarelabyrinth.com, your go-to source for healthcare news.
Welcome back, and we hope you're enjoying this episode of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. We're talking about Vance's big lie at the VP debate about how Trump salvaged the ACA. I believe he threatened it. And we talked about some of the plan participation and premium increases and enrollment drops to show that. So really, in conclusion, a lot of the polls are saying that healthcare is important to people. I think it's both an economic issue and its own issue. The election is very, very close. There's no question about it. It would seem that perhaps VP Harris on the Democratic side is, perhaps on course to win the popular vote. She seems to be leading there by a couple of points, although that's also in the margin of error. But Trump seems to have the edge in the Electoral College. It seems that right now, polling in some of those swing states we talked about, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona, most of them seem to be going more toward Trump. And Harris would have to win almost all of them to become president, whereas Trump would only have to win some of them. So Harris may be leading in the popular vote, but Trump seems to have the edge in the Electoral College. But again, things are very, very close. And I do think that healthcare could be an issue in some of these swing states. In my view, the ACA is a popular program really across all parties. Healthcare, again, is important. And when Trump and Vance seem to raise this idea of repealing the ACA and coming in with half-baked solutions, it probably undermines their support in many of these swing states. With that, we will end this edition of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thanks for joining Mark and the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. Go to healthcarelabyrinth.com each day for the latest healthcare news. See you next week on the next Healthcare Labyrinth podcast.